I never thought staying late at the office would feel like this. Like stepping into a different world, one stripped of chatter, phones ringing, and footsteps echoing down hallways. After dark, the building changed. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the windows reflected only shadows, and every sound seemed to stretch longer than it should. I sat hunched at my desk, eyes burning from hours of data entry, but I kept going. I wasn't really there for the numbers. I was there for him. Daniel Harper. My boss. To everyone else, he was untouchable, the kind of man who spoke with authority and carried himself like he owned the air around him. Mid-40s, sharp jaw, shoulders built from years of discipline in everything he did. His reputation was clean, professional, impenetrable. But to me, he was more than that. He was the reason my chest tightened every time his footsteps approached. And tonight, we were the only two left in the office. I told myself it was nothing. Just overtime. Just another late night spent proving myself, trying to show him I could be more than the junior analyst fresh out of college. But every time I looked up and found his eyes on me, that excuse unraveled. Still alive over there? Daniel's voice broke the quiet, low and warm in the empty space. I swallowed and forced a smile. Barely. These numbers are starting to swim. He leaned back in his chair, stretching, the leather groaning under him. His tie was loosened, his collar open in a way I'd never seen during the day. That small bit of undone formality felt almost intimate, like a secret he didn't share with anyone else. You don't have to kill yourself over this, he said, softer this time. You've done more than enough. But I didn't want to stop. Not while he was here. Not while this silence pressed against us, thick and alive, like the building itself was holding its breath. I nodded anyway, pretending to consider his words, though I kept my pen in hand. My gaze drifted up to him, and for a second I forgot to look away. His eyes met mine, steady, unreadable. But there was something there. Something more than a boss checking on his employee. My throat tightened. I dropped my eyes back to the page, suddenly aware of how warm the room had grown. The clock crept past midnight. Papers blurred. My body begged for rest. Still I stayed. Daniel rose from his desk and walked over, his presence filling the small space between us. He leaned against the edge of my desk, close enough that I could catch the faint scent of his cologne, subtle, grounding. You notice how different this place feels when it's empty? He asked. I looked up, caught again in his gaze. Yeah, I admitted. Like it's not meant to be this quiet. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that wasn't meant for meetings or presentations. A private smile. Exactly. For a moment, neither of us moved. The storm outside began to rattle the windows, and the sound wrapped around us like a veil. I could feel his presence, not just see it, not just hear it, but feel it. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but my voice caught. His eyes searched mine, and I swore the space between us shifted, shrinking in ways I couldn't explain. Then, just as quickly, he straightened, pushing off the desk. The air released, like a string pulled too tight suddenly cut. Don't stay too late, he murmured, retreating toward his desk. But it was already too late. Something had changed. I stared at the page in front of me, though I couldn't read a single word. My pen hovered uselessly. The memory of his closeness lingered, the warmth, the look in his eyes, the silence that wasn't just silence anymore. I thought it was just overtime, but the way he looked at me told a different story. And I couldn't stop myself from wondering what would happen if the night kept going. The storm outside had grown violent, rain streaking against the glass in wild diagonals. Thunder rolled over the city like a warning, but inside, the office felt like a capsule, sealed off, suspended, holding only the two of us. Daniel had loosened further, his jacket folded neatly over the back of his chair, his sleeves pushed to his elbows. For a man who was always crisp, always composed, it felt like watching armor slip away piece by piece. And I couldn't stop noticing. I told myself to focus on the work. Numbers. Reports. Spreadsheets. but every detail about him pulled me out of focus. The shape of his forearms, the veins running faintly down them, the way he pinched the bridge of his nose when he thought too hard. He wasn't just my boss in that moment. He was Daniel. And that was dangerous. At one point, he rose from his chair and walked around the desk to stand behind me. His hand brushed the back of my chair as he leaned forward, pointing to a section of my report. His arm pressed against my shoulder, warm, steady, close. "See here," he said quietly, his voice near my ear. "You've already done the hard part. The rest is just formatting." I nodded, but the words blurred. All I could register was the weight of him leaning in, the subtle shift of his breath brushing my skin. I prayed he couldn't hear how uneven my own breathing had become. When he pulled back, it was slow, almost reluctant. My body ached with the absence. "You're tense," he said suddenly, his eyes scanning me in a way that wasn't just managerial. "Just tired," I muttered, though it wasn't true. Tiredness didn't make my chest hammer like this. He leaned against the edge of my desk again, his posture relaxed but his gaze too sharp. "You work harder than anyone here. But sometimes," he paused, considering, "sometimes I think you don't know when to stop." His words should have felt like critique, but they didn't. They felt like he saw me, saw past the reports, past the role, straight into the part of me that wanted to be noticed. The thunder cracked again, shaking the window. Instinctively, I flinched. And then, before I could process it, his hand rested lightly on my knee under the desk. Just a touch. Steady. Not enough to claim anything, but too much to be written off as casual. I froze. My pulse roared in my ears. He didn't move his hand away. He just looked at me, waiting, as if daring me to speak. I couldn't. The silence between us thickened, charged with everything I didn't know how to name. My throat tightened, my hands curling against the desk. His fingers tapped once, deliberate, quiet, before he withdrew, leaving behind a heat that burned long after. Neither of us mentioned it. We didn't need to. The storm pressed on. Papers shifted in the draft from the vent. The world beyond those windows didn't matter. The only reality I could hold on to was the way his eyes kept finding mine, the way my body felt tuned only to him. I tried to return to my work, but the numbers no longer made sense. The report in front of me was nothing but ink on paper. All that mattered was the question that echoed louder and louder in my mind. What was that? When I finally looked up, Daniel was still watching me. Not with authority. Not with distance. But with something I couldn't mistake. It wasn't nothing. And for the first time, I let myself wonder if he wanted me to know that. The storm began to quiet, but inside the office, silence took its place. It wasn't the kind of silence born from focus or fatigue. It was heavier, as though every unspoken thought between us had gathered in the air, waiting. I sat with my pen poised over the page, though I hadn't written a word in half an hour. I could still feel his hand on my knee, a ghost of heat that refused to fade. Daniel hadn't mentioned it, hadn't acknowledged it, and that silence was more unsettling than if he had. I rose, needing space, and made my way to the kitchenette. The machine hissed as I poured coffee into a mug, the sound too loud against the stillness. My reflection stared back at me in the window, messy hair, tired eyes, and something else I didn't want to name. Daniel's footsteps followed. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he stood beside me, leaning one hand on the counter, his tie hanging loose. I could see him in the glass too, his expression softer than the version he wore in daylight. "You ever feel like this job takes too much out of you?" he asked suddenly, his voice lower than usual, as though admitting a secret. I glanced at him, startled. Daniel never opened doors like this. He was always composed, deliberate, untouchable. But now his eyes carried something raw, something weary. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it." He studied me for a long moment, his jaw tightening, then softening. "You remind me of myself when I was your age. Staying late, caring more than I should. Wanting to prove something. I swallowed, unsure whether his words were meant to caution me or confess something about himself. And did it work? Did proving yourself give you what you wanted? His mouth curved, half smile, half ache. Not exactly. The answer lingered, unspoken things hanging behind it. I wanted to ask what he meant, but his hand brushed mine as he reached for the sugar, and the question scattered. The touch was fleeting, but deliberate. He could have avoided me. He didn't. Back at the desks, the silence grew heavier, but it no longer felt empty. It felt full, crowded with things neither of us dared to voice. By 2 a.m., my body sagged with exhaustion. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. A moment later, I felt it, his hand on my shoulder. Firm. Grounding. You should rest, he murmured. I didn't move. His hand stayed warm and steady. My pulse thudded beneath his touch, but I didn't pull away. Neither did he. We sat like that, him standing, me seated, locked in a silence that was louder than any thunder. My eyes opened slowly, meeting his. The look in them was undeniable. Not managerial, not casual, but something else entirely. I wanted to speak, to break the tension, to ask him what this meant. But the words never came. Instead, I let the silence speak for us both. When he finally pulled his hand away, it was with a reluctance I could feel. And in that instant, I knew, whatever this was, it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't nothing. And sooner or later, one of us would have to admit it. By the time the clock neared 3, exhaustion had settled into my bones, but there was no point in pretending I could focus anymore. My reports lay scattered across the desk, useless in their half-finished state. What kept me awake wasn't work. It was the weight of every glance, every silence, every ghost of contact that had passed between Daniel and me tonight. He stood by the window now, staring out at the storm. The city stretched beyond us, dark and washed in rain, but he looked like he belonged nowhere but here, in this office, in this hour, with me. You should go home, he said without turning. His voice was even, but softer than before. I hesitated. Are you leaving? A pause. Then he shook his head. Not yet. I rose from my chair, needing to move, to break the distance that had been gnawing at me since his hand left my shoulder. My steps carried me toward him before I had time to think. When I reached the window, I leaned against the glass beside him. Our reflections met in the pane, side by side, blurred by raindrop. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Finally, he sighed, his voice barely above the hum of the storm. You make this job feel less empty. The confession stunned me, not because of the words themselves, but because of how naked they sounded coming from him. Daniel Harper didn't do vulnerable. But there it was. I turned to face him, searching his profile. And you make it harder to keep pretending I don't notice. His head tilted, his eyes locking onto mine. For the first time, there was no mask, no professional distance. Just him. The silence swelled, trembling with the weight of everything unsaid. My chest rose and fell, uneven. Then, before I could question it, his hand lifted, slow, deliberate, and rested against the side of my face. I froze, breath caught. His thumb brushed just beneath my cheekbone, light, careful, as if testing whether I'd pull away. I didn't. The touch stayed. Longer than it should have. Longer than was safe. I felt the warmth of his palm seep into me, grounding and electric all at once. My heart hammered so violently I was sure he could feel it beneath my skin. His eyes softened, his jaw tense with restraint. Daniel, I whispered, my voice breaking under the weight of his name. He inhaled sharply, his hand trembling just slightly before he pulled it back. The loss stung, leaving my skin cold. He turned away, pacing a few steps, running a hand through his hair. This can't, his voice faltered. You're my employee. I'm your boss. It's too late, I cut in quietly, surprising even myself. He stopped, shoulders rigid, his back to me. The rain rattled against the glass, filling the silence he couldn't answer. And in that silence, the truth pressed heavier than any storm. We had crossed into something we could never fully undo. Neither of us said it aloud, but we both knew. What happened tonight wasn't a mistake. And whatever came next, it would change everything. The storm had thinned to a drizzle, but inside, everything between us still felt volatile, like one wrong word could ignite it all. Daniel hadn't moved far from the window. His back was to me, rigid, hands braced on the sill as though holding himself together. I stood where he'd left me, still feeling the phantom heat of his palm on my cheek. I could have convinced myself it was nothing if it hadn't lasted that long. But it had. And it wasn't nothing. "Daniel," I said softly. His shoulders tightened, but he didn't turn. "You should forget it. Pretend it didn't happen." The words stung, though his voice carried no conviction. If anything, it cracked under the strain of saying them. I stepped closer, slow, steady. "I can't pretend. Not after tonight." He finally faced me, his expression conflicted. Authority warred with vulnerability in his eyes, but underneath it all was something raw, something that had been simmering long before tonight. "You don't understand what this means," he said, his tone rough. "If anyone ever found out—" I cut him off, firmer now. "I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about you and me." The words hung heavy, and for the first time, his mask broke completely. His chest rose sharply, his lips parting as though he'd been caught unprepared. I moved closer until only a breath separated us. My heart pounded, but my voice was steady. "It doesn't feel like nothing." His eyes closed briefly, as though the admission struck deeper than he'd prepared for. When they opened again, they shone with a mix of fear and longing. "You think I don't feel it too?" he whispered, almost bitter with the weight of holding it in. "Every time I look at you, every second we've been here tonight, it's been tearing me apart." Hearing him admit it unraveled something inside me. The silence between us was no longer restraint, it was surrender waiting to happen. Without thinking, I reached up, my fingers brushing the cuff of his sleeve. The touch was small, but it carried the weight of every unspoken word. He didn't move away. For a long moment we stood locked in that fragile closeness, neither crossing fully, neither retreating. The air vibrated with restraint and yearning. "I don't know what this is," I admitted, voice low. "But I don't want to push it back into silence. Not anymore." Daniel's gaze flickered between my eyes and my mouth, his breath uneven. For a heartbeat I thought he would kiss me. Instead, he exhaled shakily and leaned forward, not quite lips, not quite distance, until his forehead rested gently against mine. The contact was tender, intimate, devastatingly human. His hand found mine, fingers threading carefully as though afraid they might break. We stayed like that, holding on to each other in a silence far more honest than words. Finally, he whispered, "What if this is real?" I closed my eyes, leaning into him, my chest trembling. "Then I don't want to run from it." The answer hung between us, fragile but certain. We didn't need to name it yet. We didn't need to solve the impossibility of what lay ahead. In that moment, it was enough to know we were no longer pretending. The storm outside had ended, but between us, something had only just begun. Daniel's forehead rested against mine, his breath mingling with mine, both of us trembling under the weight of what we'd just admitted without fully saying. For the first time that night, I felt no need to fill the silence. It wasn't empty anymore, it was ours. I don't know how long we stayed like that, but eventually he pulled back just enough to see my face. His eyes searched mine as if memorizing me, every line, every shift in expression. There was no authority in his gaze now, no distance. Only a man stripped bare. "You have no idea how long I've been holding this in," he murmured, almost as if confessing to himself. I squeezed his hand, still locked with mine. "Maybe I do." A quiet laugh slipped from him, surprised, pained, but warm. He let out a slow breath, and in it, something in him seemed to release. Tension, resistance, fear. I felt it in the way his shoulders eased, in the way his thumb brushed softly over my knuckles. We moved back to the desks, but not apart. He sat in the chair beside mine, close enough that our knees touched under the table. We didn't speak much. There wasn't a need. The reports lay abandoned, forgotten in a sea of paper, while we leaned into the quiet like it was the only thing keeping us steady. Every so often, he'd glance at me, and I'd catch him before he could look away. We didn't pretend anymore. Strange, he said at one point, his voice low, thoughtful. I thought if this ever happened I'd feel panic. But right now, his hand shifted, brushing against my arm deliberately. I just feel here. I turned, meeting his gaze. Me too. We fell into conversation after that, soft, meandering, the kind you don't plan. He asked about my childhood, about what I'd wanted to be before I ended up here. I asked him about his first years in the industry, the mistakes, the sacrifices. He shared stories no boss would ever tell an employee, and I listened as though every word was a gift. And somewhere in the middle of a story about his first disastrous presentation, he laughed, a full, unguarded laugh that cracked the air open. I realized then I'd never heard him sound so young. The night slipped by unnoticed. The storm had ended completely, leaving the city washed and glistening beyond the windows. Inside, time felt suspended. At one point, my head grew heavy, exhaustion finally claiming me. I leaned back, closing my eyes, only to feel his hand come to rest lightly on my shoulder again. I opened my eyes to find him watching me, not with concern, but with a tenderness that made my chest ache. You should sleep, he whispered. I shook my head faintly, though my body betrayed me by sinking into the warmth of his touch. Not yet. He didn't argue. Instead, he shifted, leaning closer until our shoulders pressed together. The contact was quiet, natural, as if we'd done this 100 times before. My pulse quickened, but I didn't move away. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed like that, us sitting side by side, held by a silence that felt more like music than absence. Eventually, without warning, he tilted his head and pressed the faintest kiss to my temple. Just a brush. Just enough to steal my breath. It wasn't fire. It wasn't reckless. It was softer than anything I'd imagined, and because of that, it struck deeper. He didn't look at me afterward, didn't need to. His hand found mine again under the desk, and I held on, knowing there was no going back. I hadn't known I was waiting for this. Waiting for him. But now that it was here, I couldn't imagine ever letting it go. The city was still half asleep when the first threads of dawn crept through the office windows. Pale light spilled across the papers scattered on the desks, turning the ink into shadows. My eyes fluttered open, disoriented at first, until I felt the weight of Daniel's hand still resting on mine. He hadn't moved. For a fleeting moment, I let myself just watch him. His head tilted slightly back, eyes closed, the rigid lines of his face softened in sleep. He looked younger like this, almost vulnerable, as though the years of command and control had slipped away with the night. I could have stayed like that forever, but morning has a way of pulling truth to the surface. He stirred, blinking against the dim light, and when his gaze found mine, there was no panic. Only quiet recognition. "Morning," he murmured, voice rough with sleep. "Morning," I echoed. We sat there in that fragile pause, the kind that begs to be broken but resists because once it is, the spell is gone. And then, inevitably, he spoke. "This." His thumb brushed over my hand before he drew it back, slow, reluctant. "It can't exist here, not like this." I swallowed, throat tight. "I know. But knowing didn't make it hurt less." He rose from the chair, running a hand through his hair, pacing a short line before stopping by the window. The light framed him in a way that made him seem both unreachable and closer than ever. He turned, and for the first time, there was no mask, no pretense. Just a man standing in the wreckage of his own defenses. "I don't regret it," he said, voice steady. "Not 1 second of last night. But we have to be careful. If the world knew, if the office even guessed, it would tear both of us apart." Something inside me wanted to fight, to tell him consequences didn't matter, But I didn't. Because he was right. Because love, or whatever we were inching toward, wasn't always enough to shield against the cruelty of exposure. I stood too, moving closer, not closing the distance completely, but enough that he felt me there. Then we don't let them know. Whatever this is, we keep it ours. His eyes softened, and for the briefest second, hope flickered. He stepped closer, closing the last inches, until our breaths mingled again. His hand lifted, hesitated, then cupped my jaw with a tenderness that undid me. Whatever this becomes, he whispered, almost to himself, we hold it here. Between us. The kiss he pressed to my lips was nothing like the tentative brush from the night before. It was firmer, deliberate, a claim and a promise, even if unspoken. When he pulled back, I could see the conflict still warring inside him, the man he'd been for years, and the one standing here now. Do you think we can? I asked quietly. He gave a faint, crooked smile that carried equal parts fear and determination. We'll have to. The clock ticked loud in the background, reminding us the world would soon intrude. Phones would ring. Doors would open. The illusion of isolation would break. But for that sliver of morning, we let ourselves exist untouched. His forehead pressed to mine once more, my hand gripping the fabric of his sleeve like an anchor. I didn't know what tomorrow would look like, or how we'd survive the tension of keeping something so fragile hidden. But I knew this. I wasn't walking away. And neither was he. Whatever this became, secret, fleeting, or something we could never name, we had already chosen it. And somehow that was enough.